Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jason Marzak, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's unrest Latin America Center. Whether you're in the U.S., in Peru, or anywhere else in the world, today's conversation is important for drawing attention to the economic impact of social unrest, with a specific focus on the situation in Peru today. Our purpose is to shed light on the challenges facing businesses in Peru and discuss action-oriented responses to mitigate the impact of social unrest. Of course, unrest in Peru is not an isolated incident, but is rather a phenomenon that we've seen throughout the region. The fallout from the global pandemic, Russia's war in Ukraine, continued energy prices at a record high, high food prices have contributed to a general sense of dissatisfaction with the status quo, further exacerbating the current climate of unrest. And in Peru, over the past few months, following the impeachment of Pedro Castillo, we've seen widespread protests that have isolated and paralyzed many regions and cities. The Peruvian Central Bank reports that due to the political instability and unrest, the growth rate for last year was reduced by nearly half a percentage point. The social impact has been equally significant, with widespread polarization and division among different social groups. Protests have severely impacted local, international businesses. Roadblocks, airport shutdowns, and other forms of economic disruption have affected key sectors such as mining, agriculture, and tourism. And people have lost their lives as well due to the continued violence. Although that violence has subsided in many areas, the cost of recovery remains high. Here at the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, we recognize the importance of the private sector as a vehicle for economic growth. Therefore, we're committed to strengthening public-private partnerships and fostering cutting-edge and forward-looking solutions to address the challenges faced in Peru and in other countries. Today's representatives from the private sector, government officials, and civil society actors will advance that discussion.
Thank you, Jason. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's conversation. We're thrilled to have you all here as we analyze the wave of social unrest in Peru and potential future scenarios for the country. In today's conversation, we have gathered an esteemed group of experts and practitioners to share their perspectives on this critical issue. We'll begin with a 10-minute fireside conversation with Summit of the Americas National Coordinator Kevin O'Reilly, who will provide us with the U.S. perspective on the issue at hand, followed by a brief intervention from Ambassador Jaime Cacho Souza, General Director for Economic Promotion at the Ministry of Foreign Relations of Peru. Finally, we'll conclude with a 40-minute moderator panel discussion in Spanish featuring Fernando Calmel, President of Peru's Association of Entrepreneurs, Mabel Huertas, Managing Partner at 50+1 Political Analysis, Miriam Kornblith, Senior Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the National Endowment for Democracy, and Rafael Sagnich, Head of Economic Research at COMEX Peru. Simultaneous interpretation is available in English and Spanish in channels 1 and 2 respectively. If you have any questions, feel free to post them on the Zoom chat. We're honored to have such distinguished experts join us today, and we look forward to their insight and contributions to this conversation. Now, moving to the first portion of the conversation, I would like to welcome Summit of America's National Coordinator, Kevin O'Reilly. At the Atlantic Council, we have had the privilege of collaborating with you around the Summit of the Americas, on our programming in Venezuela, Andean Affairs, and now on the City Summit. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to continue working together to strengthen U.S. engagement towards the region. And again, welcome back, Kevin. My first question to you is about your perception. What do you think? What are your thoughts? How do you see the U.S. is perceiving the current situation in Peru? What measures is the U.S. government taking to collaborate with partners to address the root causes of social unrest, such as inequality, political polarization, etc.? Again, welcome.
Well, thanks. It's very nice to have the chance to be with you and with everyone here today. Look, I mean, some of these are very obvious points. You know, the Peruvian people deserve stable democratic institutions that operate in accordance with Peru's national constitution, that follow the the standards that of the Inter-American Democratic Charter and carry out their democratic governance mandates. We're obviously concerned about the unrest that has beset Peru in of late, and we've advocated, and our ambassador Lisa Kenna in Lima continues to advocate for dialogue for an end to the violence. We obviously watch these events closely because our number one priority, just like any foreign ministry for any government around the world, is to assist our citizens and to protect them and their interests when they're abroad. So we follow these reports of violence against with great concern, and particularly against when they're targeted against media and others, because democracy depends on a free and active press and a free and active exchange of ideas and on dialogue. Now, you know, you mentioned that I've been working over the course of the last year as our national summit coordinator, and I think if you look at the agenda of the Summit of the Americas and this upcoming city summit that we're organizing, we focus on these priorities. And I have to say that that the Peruvian authorities have been extraordinarily supportive of this agenda that we've developed to figure out how to recover from the shocks imposed on our region for because of the pandemic and what has flowed out of the pandemic. And we all know that Peru suffered shocks that are really almost disproportionate compared to even others in the hemisphere. And you know, a really the pandemic imposed a heavy toll. And over the last year, the country was starting to recover get its economic feet back under it, but these recent conditions, the recent circumstances, the protests have taken a direct toll on some of these sectors, and perhaps you could say in mining and others. This is going to be a delayed income, so it exacts a cost, but certain products will still find their way to market. For others, perishables, for tourism, for others, they are lost opportunities. And so if you take just the question of economics, obviously it's just that's one factor. But of course, look, we're going to be supportive. We're going to continue to support Peruvian efforts to maintain a dialogue, to strengthen democratic institutions, and we're going to work with Peruvians in support of that goal and with the governments of our region.
Thank you for your answer. And thinking about this concept you repeat a lot during your response about stability of democratic institutions, I'd like to pivot a little bit about the role of the private sector in protecting, in promoting the strengthening of democratic institutions, specifically the U.S. private sector. In what ways can local and international business contribute to strengthening of democratic institutions that can effectively support undeserved communities in Peru?
Well, I guess one way, you know, in a lot of industries, particularly in the mining industry, in extractives, which are of course a major source of income for exports for the Peruvian nation, there's this old concept of a social license to operate. And what does that mean, really? It comes down to, and I'm simplifying very much here, but it comes down to creating the circumstances by which the other, you know, all players in an economy where, you know, an extractives firm or firms operate have transparency and trust, and that they understand that costs aren't being unreasonably imposed, and that costs aren't being unreasonably externalized for the production of the firm. And I think that, you know, this is a constant tension in any community where those kinds of firms operate, but it's one where I think that um, U.S. firms operating in Peru try to take it very seriously. And what does that really mean? It's that being responsive to community needs and being responsive to and transparent about how you're operating in an economy. And you could call it as well just being a good community, a good citizen of the community in which you operate. But I think this question of social license really is a question of democratic or operating in an open way in a democratic society. And I think that the basic principle is an area where I think folks can have a positive impact as they come looking at a problem from the, or a challenge, better to say, from the private sector and working in the society in which they're operating.
Thank you for that. And you talk about trust, and I think not only in Peru, but across the Americas and globally, that's one of the main crises that we're facing as a humanity, lack of trust. And so to wrap up this fire chat conversation, apart from the measures already in place, and again, thinking about trust, what additional steps can the international community, validators, international organizations take to help address the consequences of social unrest and to promote dialogue in the country?
Well, at first you have to recognize that these are fundamentally sovereign challenges from within a sovereign polity of Peru and the Peruvian people. I think that the question of encouraging dialogue on all sides, encouraging adherence to fundamental democratic norms on all sides, transparency and accountability are principles that we all adhere to in this hemisphere of ours, and they help restore trust. We see this in our country when there are social conflicts, that the transparency and accountability helps restore trust, and I'm sure it's the same in Peru now with this explosion of violence that people have unfortunately experienced in recent months. I think it's important to make sure that those who've breached that trust and that those democratic norms are accountable, held accountable. And I think throughout the system, that's going to help increase the sense of responsiveness. And that I think that we can all remain supportive of those efforts, and supportive of that kind of dialogue. And I think it's really both in our own interest, because we have many citizens living in Peru and we have many firms invested there, but it's also just one of the basic principles of the inter-American system and of that inter-American democratic charter I referred to, that societies stand together in solidarity with one another and try to help folks work their own way through these sorts of challenges.
And that's exactly what the main objective of this conversation and the subsequent conversations that we will organize is to promote transparency, better understanding on what's happening, and try to promote shared visions and solutions to these, working with the U.S. government and with the international community in general. So Kevin, thank you again for your time and your insights today. We look forward to collaborating on the City Summit in April to continue deepening U.S. engagement in the region. And now I would like to welcome Ambassador Jaime Cacho Souza for a brief intervention before we begin our panel discussion. Ambassador, welcome. Over to you.
Mr. Jason Maxuck, Senior Director, Center of Latin America, Adrian Arst, Atlantic Council, is Kevin O'Reilly, National Summit of the Americas, Coordinator of the Parliament of State. Dear friends, in my capacity as General Director of Economic Promotion of the Foreign Affairs Ministry of Peru, I am pleased to express the greeting of Peruvian government headed by Constitutional President Dina Boluarte. I would like to start by expressing the honor that it means for me to participate in this event organized by the Atlantic Council and an opportunity to promote investments in the country and make known the latest events that have occurred in Peru. In this sense, I would like to thank the United States government for its firm support for the democratic transition that took place recently in Peru after the failed coup d'etat by former President Pedro Castillo. I cannot avoid emphasizing that given the attempt to breach the constitutional order, the succession regime established by political constitution of my country was activated and materialized with the swearing of Mrs. Dina Boluarte as constitutional president of the Republic of Peru. This political crisis gave rise to the start of protests and mobilization that undoubtedly included legitimate demands, but also actions motivated by political interest or with the deliberate purpose of producing violence and subverting the constitutional order. The government of Peru deeply regrets the tragic loss of human lives that occur in the context of these demonstrations and acts of violence, which are being investigated by the competent entities which have full freedom and constitutional autonomy to find the truth and to judge the responsibles. I reaffirm Peru's absolute commitment to the preservation of democratic values and principles and to the full and unrestricted enforcement of the human rights and the rule of law. Thus, acting accordingly, Peru has received, at our invitation, visits from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Likewise, our main international partners, both regional and extra-regional, have conveyed their support to Peru regarding the defense of the rule of law, democracy, and the protection and defense of human rights. It causes deep discomfort that some sectors have prioritized their ideological agenda over democratic values, taking advantage of the political situation to capitalize on social discontent in the favor or seek instability in our country. Recent estimates indicate that the protests have been generated billions of dollars in losses that affect the country's population as a whole. Given this, the government of President Boluarte has been restoring order throughout the country and activating public programs with the aim of re-energizing the economic flow in all our regions, with a special emphasis on those most affected by the protests, always focus on respect for the integrity of our citizens and the promotion of investments with social profitability. Focusing on the economic sphere, Peru continues to grow. 2022 witnessed growth of 2.7% thanks to the dynamism of our economy under the premise of achieving economic reactivation and investment of approximately $1,500 million has been allocated through the Compunche Peru program with a view to generating more than 130,000 by the end of this year. The most important investment rating agencies such as Moody's, Standard & Poor's Global Rating, and IDB have been highlighting the sustainability of the fiscal measures adopted by the Peruvian National Administration in an adverse economic context. I should also highlight that fiscal solvency, significant international reserves, efficient economic and regulatory management, favorable macroeconomic climate, legal stability of foreign capital, and the country's dynamic performance in the international market are key factors highly valued by investors present in the country. Furthermore, Peru considers the United States as a key strategic partner for development. During 2022, foreign direct investment for the country registered more than $3 billion distributed in key sectors such as mining, industry, finance, energy, commerce, oil, among others. At the same time, we have a free trade agreement since 2009, a very important instrument for the economic development of Peru, thanks to which the value of our exports to the USA registered in 2021 the record figure of $6,362 million. During the current year, the Investment Promotion Agency of Peru, Proinversión, aims to award 16 public-private partnerships, projects, and projects in assets for $3,000 million. Likewise, the Ministry of Agrarian Development and Irrigation has the objective of presenting for this year a package proposal for a government-to-government execution agreement for approximately 3,356 million soles. Similarly, in the mining sector, the Ministry of Energy and Mines has updated this year the portfolio of mining investment projects, which made up of 47 mining projects that encompass an investment of $53,715 million, with the aim of achieving operational startup and starting mining activities such as exploitation and in accordance with current regulations. Recently, an important Peruvian delegation, headed by the Prime Minister, participated in the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada 2023 with the purpose of providing information to the investment opportunities in this sector and providing confidence to international investors. As can be seen, Peru does not stop and continues with conviction and determination the path of growth and development for the last 20 years, based on a foreign policy structure and based on principles, as well as state policies that give a sense of continuity, stability, and long-term vision, which allows us to differentiate the temporary from the permanent. In this sense, Peru reaffirms itself as a country firmly committed to an international order based on rules which values dialogue and mutual negotiation as the best tool to exercise its role as an emerging middle power in the international system with the objective to defend our own interests. Peru pursues, through multilateral forums, the search of peace, global security, and the peaceful solution of disputes, respect for international law, the promotion of democratic institutions, and respect for fundamental freedom and human rights, as well as the principles established in the Charter of the United Nations. Finally, I would like to remind you of the Peruvian writer Ciro Alegría, who stated, "Peru has a long history of overcoming problems and difficulties. I am sure that we will get ahead once again."
Thank you for your insightful comments, Ambassador. It is great to have you here with us today to discuss this critical topic. Now I will start the panel discussion in Spanish, so please switch to the channel 2 for simultaneous English interpretation. Y ahora sí, comenzamos el panel en español. Empiezo.
We're now going to begin in Spanish. The spiral that was unleashed by the attempted coup d'etat of former President Castillo led to blockades in highways, closing of airports, and other disruptions of different sectors. It is estimated that the cost of the protest were about $21 billion. This attempted coup d'etat was not the only thing that unleashed these protests. It's a bit more complex than that, and we will be discussing this. At the same time, beyond the images that we've seen, we have seen that the country has had several presidents over the recent years and many crises. It does have a resilient and strong private sector nonetheless. We will be looking at different political issues, bringing about elections earlier than anticipated, and constitutional reforms. And so we want to look at the impact this may have in Peru on the business sector. Mabel, I would like to know how foreign investors and multinational businesses have reacted to these social protests, and what has been done to mitigate any risks. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. 50+1, where I work, we want to be able to improve the situation. It's nothing new, however, this kind of crisis. I did want to take some time so that the public with us can understand how the crisis and conflicts have become something normal in our country. And this comes from 2016. No president has actually finished out their term, not even vice presidents that have taken over from these presidents. They may face the same fate as our current president. We've had 3 Congresses since 2016 that have been elected. And this means that we have mistrust and undermining of institutions. Right now, the Congress has been approving laws that are not constitutional, and their ratings are very, very low. That's quite usual. But now their approval ratings are the worst ever that we can remember. In Martin Vizcarra, I think in 2018, the Congress was equally as unpopular. However, given these low approval ratings, well, it's very attractive to try to rule through populism. The Congress, for example, has been legislating to affect prices and to affect different sectors. And if we talk about different sectors, we can talk about ministries, the changes and constant changes in presidents means we've had many ministers. Under Castillo, we had 81 changes in ministers. This is very unstable for the business sector. You cannot have stability, long-term vision. This means we've also seen vacancies, motions in Congress like censure, and this means that we have a situation that undermines the Constitution. Now, if we look at subnational or regional governments, what is the situation? We have ever-present corruption, which is also present at a national level. In 2016, you may remember the Odebrecht scandal, which actually involved the president and different governors. Unfortunately, corruption is constant, and no governor seems to be able to finish out his or her mandate either because of these corruption scandals. And so we have difficulties actually concluding large projects. Just to give you some figures, of the 25 governors elected in 2018, 21 are being investigated for corruption by the public prosecutor. So we also then we have these social protests, which in the last 20 years have been a constant. We've had enormous protests in the street, but none of these have actually led to a president stepping down, with one exception. When Martin Vizcarra was in the presidency, he was very popular. However, we've seen very large protests, local protests, smaller protests, but in Peru, the government can continue in power if they have alliances. To conclude, Peru is living through constant crises. Any kind of investment in the country will come upon this kind of instability. So we are trying to create transparency and businesses that are not involved in corruption. And so it's difficult to navigate.
In this climate, there is immense uncertainty for businesses. Thank you for providing that analysis on the current situation in Peru. I'd like to turn now to you, Fernando, in your role as the president of the Association of Entrepreneurs of Peru. What are the specific mechanisms that the Peruvian government and nonprofits have implemented to help small and medium-sized enterprises and entrepreneurs during the social unrest over the last 3 months, and how effective have they been? Thank you to the Atlantic Council for the invitation. Yes, as the president of ASCP, we do grassroots work with unions and others as well. And we feel like we're in a new pandemic contagion of this crisis. It's a political pandemic, so to speak, that's leading to lots of people going out of business. The macroeconomic figures don't show that. That losing $1,000 for a peasant can be devastating, and people have to choose between treating an illness or feeding their children. So we have to take into account that private enterprise in Peru, from micro enterprises to the biggest companies, we're all entrepreneurs. A huge percentage, 20%, is informal, and of those who aren't formal, there are people who might want to formalize, but the tax system is confusing. So really, we have a failed state where every Peruvian has to be a capitalist. They can't be a communist because the state can't give us anything. You have to go out and work from the day you're born. Everyone finds regulations that aren't made for the average Peruvian, and people are stuck between a rock and a hard place. They try to follow the rules imposed by the state, but the state isn't holding up its end of the bargain. So we're, as Peruvians, accustomed to live without the state. And when there's something like this, people say, how does Peru carry on? Well, it carries on because we don't care who the congressmen are or who the president is. We just want to be left alone to work. That's the only reason why there hasn't been greater paralysis. Because when there is interference by other countries with a certain ideology, like Mexico, Bolivia, Venezuela, they're trying to interrupt and they're trying to meddle with a country that is inherently capitalist. There's no more capitalist country than Peru because we're all in the informal sector. It's the law of the jungle. It's like the 1800s in California. You survive by your wits. So what has the state done was the question. Well, unfortunately, the same thing the previous administrations have done. Con Ponche Peru is a program being promoted a great deal, but it's poorly targeted. The credits don't go to the people who need those loans. And because of the large informal sector, they don't get to the people who really need it the most. So it's just a situation where we're going to continue to have to be entrepreneurs and make it on our own. We need the issues of infrastructure to be fixed, or education. We have to pay for private education, private health, and private transport, in addition to just trying to make the profit that you need. If those problems could be solved and people could just do what they need to do, we're going to have an incredibly strong country that's never going to be tempted by communism, and you're not going to divide the country with this talk of plurinationalism. This is the situation we're in, and hopefully this administration will not just have good intentions, but will listen to leaders in the individual regions of the country. Every reality is different. There's not just one Peru, and that's what the country needs. Thank you, Fernando. I find your response to be really interesting, and it really sounds like good news. You're talking about a robust, resilient society that's autonomous in some way because they've had to make up for a lack of access and a lack of response from the government, which has caused challenges, but it's made for a stronger society. And now, as we discussed with Mr. O'Reilly, there's a crisis of confidence, and so there's an opportunity here to try to tap into the great talent that exists in this country with new measures that will aim to promote further that resilience and that talent and build on it. Thank you so much for your really informative response. Now I'd like to turn to Miriam Cornblith of the National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you for being with us here today. It's always great to hear your perspectives. And I found out that you were just in Peru this week. So you have a sense of what's going on there. So speaking of trust as that's central to our conversation today, how do you think that civil society organizations and popular movements could be more effective in promoting trust and advocating for democratic reforms and social justice reforms? And what are the biggest challenges you see that they face to doing so? Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Diego, for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this panel. I'm not Peruvian, I'm Venezuelan, but I did live in Lima for 11 years. So Peru is quite dear to my heart. I was there during formative years, so I care a great deal for Peru. As you said, I was in Lima last week meeting with the organizations that we support, meeting with a number of different individuals and institutions, people in media and the political and social spheres. And my perception is that there is great concern and uncertainty in some camps and sadness because this situation, although it feels like so many others, is a bit different. It's not business as usual entirely. It's, yes, Peru's accustomed to institutional and political crises and protests, but this feels different in that it reflects the enormous difficulties in finding a shared perspective and a way to channel the anguish into something constructive. I met with groups that are thinking about how to promote dialogue, bring people together across the spectrum, but it does require the will of all. And a major difficulty observed in Peru is the fact that the basic political institutions aren't truly representative. It's a single chamber unicameral Congress. We have about 12 million people in Lima. You have an enormous population along the coast, and that means that those that are calling out and wishing to be represented are not represented very well in Congress. We know that the presidency of Pedro Castillo came about with the fragmentation in the political realm. And yes, it was constitutional and recognized by the competent authorities, but it created a great deal of division. So the hope for healing those rifts is hard to hold up. In Lima and elsewhere in the country, we are seeing a proliferation of very harsh expressions, of racist expressions that we've been hearing. It might sound extreme, but there are basically insults being hurled at a significant percentage of the population, and that is surprising to hear, and it's done irresponsibly and too lightly. It's a very difficult situation. And again, I just want to underscore that it's not business as usual. I think in part because the pandemic really left a major mark among Peruvians, has changed their view as to who has access and who does not to the minimum standard of living. Peru had the highest number of deaths per capita owing to COVID. And what that revealed was uh, weaknesses, shortcomings in support for the common Peruvian, despite growth, despite these excellent economic performance statistics. It did not create that safety net. As Fernando was saying, there's an absence of the state, and that was highlighted and exacerbated by COVID, and that has left a great deal of resentment amongst those who felt left out in the cold, the ones who felt the brunt of COVID. And there is the custom of navigating difficult times, overcoming hurdles. But it strikes me that this is a tougher situation than those we've seen in the past, exacerbated by COVID. We haven't emerged from that fully. And when that comes together by all these other aspects and influence from outside actors, etc., and it comes on top of the rifts and the resentment in a context in which political institutions, unfortunately, are not sufficiently representative and aren't trusted, aren't sound enough, that can't convince people that they're running the country as a whole beyond the interests of anyone in particular. It's very hard to build that sense of collective trust.
Thank you. Rafael, as gerente or manager of economic studies in COMEX Peru, Miriam and Fernando have spoken, and I want to know what the government can do to actually mitigate these effects that people have felt. Well, we know that there is social unrest that is justified, and it's not just recent, it's of a long date. But no matter who's in power at a national level, well, we have a failed state. And I wanted to say that our decentralization has failed. The transfer of powers that took place to the regions and to the cities, the level of independence that they have to do whatever they want. Unfortunately, it means that growth, macroeconomic growth, which went on for 20 plus years, does not translate into quality services for citizens. And we have seen that the national government has not been able to change this, and with exceptions, we don't see governors and mayors undertaking their true responsibilities. Just to give you some figures, last year, these subnational governments did not execute projects for $16.5 billion. And that's a huge percentage of resources that are under executed. Now, also, we need to look at what's been executed and whether that translated into better services. So you have a heterogeneous country where we don't have health services in one place. Maybe you have them in Lima, but there is data that indicates that 95% of the hospital equipment is obsolete because there's no investment in maintenance, for example. So, in this regard, we believe that something needs to change, that what we have now is exhausted. Some say, or politicians will say, no, we need to address the economic issue so people have hospitals. But are you kidding? We've had investment. We've had a growth rate of 4.7% during years. So we have accumulated growth. Poverty has been reduced. Multidimensional poverty has been reduced. When we look at services, quality services, but the pending task is to invest resources and have that lead to quality services. And what Congress and those who are in power need to seek is to connect with other sectors, like the business sector. We have had terrible interventions over the year under the Garcia administration, for example. So in the business sector, well, we want to be able to reach out to citizens, but we need to change Chapter 4 of the Constitution that has to do with decentralization and autonomy. We need to look at what this means. Decentralization does mean some degree of autonomy, but this has led to a situation where these local leaders do whatever they want, and many of them are involved in corruption scandals. Last year, for example, there were 850 local investigations about corruptions. Thank you, Rafael. But one of the things you're saying is that there's a multidimensional crisis, or there are multidimensional challenges, and that there's a co-responsibility of governors, mayors, and local leaders, and a role that the business sector and civil society needs to play to look for common solutions. And Mabel, I wanted to ask you a question. Tell me specific things that the Boluarte administration should do to be able to address the root causes of this social unrest, indigenous peoples, economic issues, and what can be done. So, to be brief and look at the situation in Puno, I explained, or Fernando explained, that the Puno situation is very specific, and Puno has an important role to play. There are protests in that region, and and many things are going on there. Now, the answer to political demands has been insufficient, and the demand is not an anti-mining protest. It is these are political protests. People are asking Dina Boluarte to step down from the presidency, and so it seems like there's no margin for negotiation. The strategy that's being used is insufficient. No one is talking about a constituent assembly or to have early elections because the Congress will not agree to this. So we're not going to have a referendum on a constituent assembly or early elections. That doesn't mean that in the near future, uh, what is going on now does not lead to that situation. The strategy has been to use the armed forces, to use law enforcement, which of course they do need to restore order. There are sectors that cannot operate. For example, the mining sector cannot operate in Puno, but the consequences in the medium term are is the radicalization of people in protest. There's a contagion effect to the south, Cusco, Arequipa. And when we have these radicalized forces, we have new political leaders emerge. Leaders who in elections might be able to win. 80% of people in Puno voted for Pedro Castillo, for example. So there has not been sufficient work to be able to address people's demands. There is a decentralization process that needs to be improved for the future. Thank you, Mabel. Fernando, tell us how SMEs have been able to mitigate the interruption of supplies during the protest. Have they been able to use local production or look for other suppliers? Unfortunately, not much can be done. And we've been hard hit. Well, you have to reinvent yourself. If not, you will die from hunger. People are reinventing themselves. But in Puno, which has representatives in Congress, they are the ones who have not done their duty. Populists say everything's wonderful with a great constitution, everything will be great. Last week, I went to near Puno, and we see that people realize that they have been tricked, that the communist discourse is not a discourse that will lead to the realization of their dreams. For example, artisans and small business people are going to be in a worse situation than they were before during the pandemic. So first, we need to understand that, or people need to understand that this communist discourse is going to bring them nothing. If a state that takes advantage of this situation and can turn the tables, then of course things can be done. Of course, it's difficult to talk to people who are threatening violence. I think there's nothing to be done. Yes, it's important to have order, but of course we need to uphold human rights always, but seeking solutions is where we want to go. Miriam, how can we strengthen democratic institutions in Peru to promote social inclusion, greater dialogue? What can the international community do? Thank you, Diego. Speaking with organization there, I would say that they have an agenda of some 6 points. Points, I believe, that are very important. For example, and this has to do with what was just said, the fact that 60 people have perished in these protests, plus 6 soldiers who drowned in Puno. This, of course, led to international community and the National Ombudsman for Human Rights to really be scandalized. I mean, human rights is a key issue. And so there's been a great deal of support from the international community for human rights. The second issue on the agenda, and it was very clear, was to have inclusive social agendas. This is a long-standing issue in Peru, but I think it's worthwhile to highlight it once again. And it's led to a great deal of polarization, and thus also strengthen partnerships, create partnerships, strengthen partnerships, because what you see is we need to have the social fabric be reweaved. Now, another critical thing is this idea of fraud. Not only the sensation that there was fraud in the last elections, but in prior elections. This means that people don't trust electoral entities, the oversight entities. So international agent or communities and national entities need to be able to gain that trust back so that people trust the elections. Another issue that was very clear was the communication space, the media. You look at news on one outlet, and you could see that it was totally different on one outlet than another media outlet, and in digital media. We see this is an issue. The international community can play a role in this. And then there's a political reform agenda that needs to be focused on. Political reforms have been delayed in Peru, and they need to go forward. We need high quality candidates involved in elections. As Mabel has said, there are so many public officials, governors, mayors, who are found to be involved in corruption. And furthermore, we need to directly address the representativity of political bodies. How, to what extent does the Congress represent the people? And this has to do with the fragile state of political parties. And they're fragmented, but not only from within, but from without. And they do not have inner cohesion. They do not have cohesion with respect to their ideology either. And these are the points I saw.
Thank you so much, Miriam. So, Rafael, can you tell us how Peruvian companies have been dealing with these prolonged periods of uncertainty? How do they remain resilient? How do they survive these times? Yes, as you say, uncertainty is poison for an economy. And the data show us that we're in rough times in terms of investment, and to get out of this situation and polish up and regain our image abroad. We hope for an impact of programs like Con Ponche Peru. It does matter how such programs are targeted, of course, but there's something key. And now that we have new governors, new mayors, at every level, there are new authorities in place. So they have the chance to change the face of local government and to provide certainty. We're waiting a budget allocation of 100 million soles for officials that will support small projects, technical projects, who can help bridge the difficulties. And if people see that such projects are underway and schools are being built, etc., then they'll see that the state is present. There's no other way, no better way to generate trust than through public works. If you can't deliver, people aren't going to believe in you. Thank you so much to Rafael and everyone who participated in this really interesting conversation. I'm going to switch to English to close out the event.
Comments and questions. We look forward to continuing this conversation to elevate the importance of an engaged private sector and inclusive international engagement and attention to Peru's political situation. Thank you for joining today and stay tuned for more. Thank you.